All right, good evening, everybody. I'm very excited for this week's session of Learning with My Rabbis. One of my teachers, Dr. Rabbi Aryeh Cohen, a professor of rabbinics at the Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies in Los Angeles. I had a few different classes with him. It's really a pleasure, Rabbi, to have you on with us this week.
It's a pleasure. I'm glad to be with you, and it's the trip to Toronto was really easy.
Jumping right into things, one of the pieces of Torah that really was driven home in all of your classes is your striving for justice. So I'd love if you could speak a little bit to our community about what justice means to you as a Jewish value.
So that's a very large question. Thank you. Oh, I also want to note that you are also my teacher on ropes courses, so that's important. So justice is, I wrote a book, conveniently, called Justice in the City, which develops a theory of the just city. And there I make the claim that a just city is a city that at heart takes into account, has the residents feel relationship and responsibility and obligation for other residents in the city. The way I talk about it in the book is that it's the geographical boundaries are not the boundaries of responsibility. That everybody in a place like Los Angeles, to Toronto, to some extent, if you include kind of the environs, a place like Los Angeles is very spread out. And so there, West LA, where I live, where one of the larger Jewish communities is, barely has diplomatic relationships with Koreatown, which is like 2 miles away. But the disparities in income and in access to healthcare and all that kind of stuff is very large. And more importantly, decisions we make in West LA impact Koreatown and impact East LA and South LA. And so a just city is a city in which all of its citizens recognize that they have a responsibility beyond their neighborhood. Secondly, a just city is based on the idea of dissent, that if something is wrong, if something is unjust, then we each have a responsibility to protest, to call our elected officials, to be out in the street, to say this is not happening or cannot happen in my name. And as Heschel said, in a democracy, now I never get it right. All are responsible, but not all are culpable, but all are responsible, or the other way around, because those are synonyms for each other. But but basically, since we do live in a democracy, we have to protest against injustice because it is happening in our names. And finally, we must hear the cry of the poor. And this is based on the notion of, in the 3rd chapter of Exodus, the people of Israel crying out to God hearing the cry, and then commissioning Moses to lead them out of Egypt. But the idea is that we should not set up our cities such that we cannot hear the cries of the vulnerable and the marginalized. That we have to, and that both on a literal basis. One of the practices that I try to do, and I try to teach my students, is that when you see a homeless person, you see a person on the street asking for money, you should engage him in conversation and give them money. Not because that, and at the same time, remember that that's not solving anything. What that is solving is reminding you that they're part of your community. And also, when we build our neighborhoods and our cities, we should build them such that we are able to hear the cry of the poor. We shouldn't be using the police to kick homeless people out of our neighborhoods to other neighborhoods. We should be building houses. I mean, we should have enough shelter for homeless people. But if there are homeless people in our neighborhood, then they are part of our neighborhood. The fact that there are homeless people in one of the richest cities in the industrialized world is an abomination in and of itself. And now we're in time of the coronavirus, it is those people who were never sheltered before the coronavirus who are the most vulnerable now. And perhaps one of the, if we do our work, perhaps one of the silver linings is that all the shreds, all the ways that the social safety net has been shredded will become really obvious, and perhaps on the other side of this, we can work to make sure that doesn't happen again, that there is housing and health and access to healthcare and good jobs for all the people that need them. So that was a short answer.
It was a great answer. And it's certainly true that one of the things that's come out of this COVID is seeing the gaps in the system, seeing the vulnerable, seeing the people that really are at risk. On the scale of suffering due to COVID, I'm faring quite well, but I've become very aware of people that are not nearly as lucky when life rolled the dice. One of the things you talked about a little bit there was our responsibility to other people. And I have a question. What is my personal responsibility? We talk about, for example, at least in American politics a lot, the idea of taxing the rich, right? Somebody shouldn't have 30 houses when there are people that are living on the streets, or a $1 billion yacht. But is there a point where I am allowed to enjoy what I have, or should everything extra beyond my basic necessities be given towards people that don't have the basic necessities? Because there are so many of them. I saw a study saying that all the work in the last 30 years of the most poor across the world is essentially going to be undone by the economic downturn right now with COVID, that we're doubling the people who live in 50 cents, $1 a day. In the next year, that number is going to just double, going back to what it was 3 decades ago.
Great question. So the philosopher Peter Singer has made an argument, and more recently he moderated the argument. But he made an argument that every dollar that's not spent on your own survival is owed to people who are not surviving. Right? And his argument is basically that the world should be seen as level. And if you're standing next to a river and wearing an Armani suit, and somebody is drowning in the river, one would hope that you jump into the river and not think about the fact that you're wearing an Armani suit. And so he says, why is it just because the person is drowning in the river in front of you? What about people halfway around the globe who are dying of malaria, or who are drowning in rivers because of the fact that people are building dams in the wrong places? Do we have any less responsibility towards them? This is not really a counter-argument from, there's a lot of people who argue against that, but there's a great book called Cosmopolitanism, in which the argument there is that we have, more or less, our responsibility to the world is in proportion to the space we take up in the world. Because we don't have an absolute responsibility. I don't have an absolute responsibility to solve every problem in the world, and neither do you. But we do have a responsibility to solve our proportion of the problem. In Jewish terms, there's a basic, so in terms of financial resources, there's a basic obligation to give 10% of income. I mean, if all Americans gave 10% of their income to actual charity, as opposed to other types of charity, which is great, but as opposed to building, another wing on the university, or which is important. I teach in a university, like people that build wings on universities, building out the museum, having a park named after them. Those are great. But if every American gave 10% to things like feeding the poor, getting healthcare access for the poor, we'd have solved all those problems. Now, there is a level, but it's only 10%. It doesn't say 100%. And Judaism has no problem with people enjoying their wealth after this basic understanding that we've solved everybody's basic necessities. There is an argument that inequality brings in its wake its own set of evils. So, what I mean by that is not necessarily mathematical equality, but the inequality that we have, for example, in the United States, where the 1% of the population, a very small group of people, owns as much wealth as the rest of the population, what happens is that they live in a hermetically sealed world because they basically hang out with other people who are billionaires and have their own private jets and go to their own islands. And even if they're nice people, let's say they're all great people, but their understanding of what the necessities of people who don't have their level of resources is completely skewed by who they are, because a lot of what we know about the world is by our own interactions with the world. And so you get a culture of wealth which is at odds with the culture in the world. And so what I would say is that, so first of all, one must say that some people have profited off the pandemic, like there are war profiteers. Jeff Bezos has made hundreds of millions of dollars off the pandemic. And so there's a certain menschlichkeit, a certain moral obligation to put that back in, especially since his workers are not making more money, and a lot of his and in Amazon it took a long time before he actually gave his workers personal protective equipment and proper breaks for hand washing. Lots of Amazon workers were getting sick. And this is on top of all the problems beforehand, wherein Amazon is based on, your job security is based on whether or not you can perform tasks in a certain amount of time. And so in some of the warehouses, there was an EMT van, an emergency medical van outside the warehouse because they knew that people would faint from overwork, exhaustion, and, dehydration, trying to match their goals. So Amazon was an awful employer beforehand, aside from the fact that other awful things that it does, and Amazon Web Services providing data for the Department of Homeland Security, which powers the Immigration and Customs Enforcement and stuff like that. But that's even without getting into all the evil that they do. They are, Jeff Bezos personally profited from the pandemic, and so there seems to be a moral obligation for him to plow some of that money back into the economy. And to go back to the opening statement is that when I say that we're responsible for the relative space that we take up on the planet, that means the wealth that we have, the position we have, the power we have, and the privilege we have. So a person who's surviving on $1 a day has less of a responsibility towards the planet than Jeff Bezos or George Soros. On the other hand, that person also has a responsibility, and that's one of the wonderful things about Jewish law is that everybody has a responsibility to give tzedakah, and that means that what that does is also say that everybody is part of the community, because being part of the community is measured by one's obligations towards the community and towards others. And so that's why a lot of homeless advocates advocate for having homeless courts, wherein homeless people could, be taken to court for not paying fines and stuff like that, and could also sue other people. But in our society, which is so bounded and defined by the legal system, if a homeless person can't appear in court or be summoned to court, he's not or she's not a real person. So in the same way, in Jewish law, a person who is a real person is a person who is obligated to give tzedakah and to be part of the community. So everybody has an obligation. Everybody's obligation is proportional, in my opinion, I think, and I think this is within Jewish law, to their proportional place on the planet.
That's a teaching I've always loved, the idea that everybody gives 10%. If I were to give $100, that person would maybe would owe 10, and then $1, and then 10 cents, and even a penny down the line. And there's also always sort of a reminder of looking at what we do have, that there's always going to be someone to the right of me that has more, but it's a reminder that there always is going to be someone beneath me that needs something. Someone needs that penny that's going to make a difference to someone, that person that only got the 10 cents to give a penny to. And I know Peter Singer, just as a side note for everyone watching, it's actually a really great, I believe it's an essay, The Life You Can Save, where that idea comes from, or maybe it was a book, I can't remember.
Well, the extreme idea is in a book, I don't remember the title, and then there's an essay that appeared in the New York Times Magazine called how much billionaires owe and how much you owe, or something like that. The obligation of something like that.
Well, one of the things I know it started through his work was this movement for blanking on it now, something altruism, where it was really about giving your money where it goes the most. And he actually started a nonprofit, effective altruism. And he has a nonprofit, I think it's called GiveWell, that evaluates other nonprofits based off of how much of the money goes to administrative costs, to advertising, to other things, versus what is actually saving a life, where you get the most bang for your buck. So I really encourage anyone watching to take a look. It's a really informative resource when you're deciding where to give your funds. But you ended up talking a little bit about the court system there. And I know in your book, Justice in the City, you talk about restorative justice as something. And I think you and I have arrived at restorative justice in very different paths, but it's something that I've really come to firmly believe in. And I was wondering if you could share a little bit with the audience about what restorative justice is, and in the Jewish sense, why is it a Jewish idea?
So I'd be happy to. And thank you for that. There's the largest level of restorative justice and to the smallest level of restorative justice. And I think they're all important. So the smallest form, I don't know the smallest, but the restorative justice is if I drive my pickup into your living room, right? And I destroy your, so now the question is, what happens to me, right? What do we do? How do we figure that out? So the punitive justice system, which in other words, the justice system, takes me to court, charges me with damaging your property. There could be a civil lawsuit where you sue me, but in the criminal justice, in the legal system, that's the government's the criminal system. I'm charged with battery, with attempted, perhaps even attempted murder if you were there, perhaps all kinds of crimes, trespassing, and I'm sentenced to whatever I'm sentenced to. If this was a crime where I ran you over on purpose, and then you survived, you have nothing to say in the court. You're as the victim of a crime, you have nothing really to say, and it's the state. It's actually in the United States, at least, and I think in most Western countries, it's the state versus the offender. And then sometimes in the United States, there's been a victims' rights movement. So after the offender is found guilty, then the victim of the crime gets a chance to make a statement asking for harsher or more lenient penalties. What this does is there's no discourse, there's no conversation between the offender and the offended person. The restorative justice model is based on the simple notion that the end goal of the justice system should be to restore that which has been destroyed. And what has been destroyed is the fabric of society. And so if I attack you, God forbid, what has been destroyed is the basis of a relationship between me and you. And on a larger scale, this has destroyed the possibility for us living in community. And so a restorative justice process would then actually seat the two of us opposite each other with, once we've both agreed to it, or once you've agreed to it, as the victim, and then with other people mediating, either with just one or two mediators or in circle sentencing, and then we together come to an agreement as to what I, as the offender, would have to do to make you whole again. Now that could be compensation, it could be just that I come and hear your story, who you are, what it is that happened to you because of what I did, and that's up to you, right? So there have been cases of restorative justice where, let's say, there were racist attacks, and somebody was beaten up because of a racist attack, and so the offender had to learn about the history of racism in the United States, had to accompany the victim of the attack to school, had to, all kinds of things which were agreed upon, so that the point being that the victim was made whole. The victim should feel confident now, once again, walking down the street and not worrying about that kind of attack. Now that's on the personal, interpersonal basis. I'm privileged to have had a lot of personal interaction with this. We created, when I worked with an organization, I was on the board of an organization called Progressive Jewish Alliance. We created something called the Jewish Community Justice Project, in which we mediated first and second time nonviolent offenses, nonviolent juvenile offenses. So things, shoplifting and vandalism, things like that. And I can tell you that there was massive transformation that happened in those interactions between a young person who had shoplifted from a store and the store owner or the person who was responsible for stopping shoplifting, recognizing what the impact of their actions could have been as a shoplifter, and also recognizing that somebody cares about them. And now this has gone beyond nonviolent juvenile offenses, and there are people who are doing restorative justice programs for violent offenders also. In the larger question that this poses, and that we have to grapple with as a society, is mass incarceration. We are using the carceral system. The United States incarcerates more people than on absolute numbers and also percentage than any place in the world. More than China, more than Russia, more than ever was in the Gulag. It's insane, the numbers.
So America is number one in some area, we're saying.
There you go. And we're also number one in all measures of self-confidence. We are the most self-confident society in the world. And we're also number one in producing armaments. So we're number one in a number of different places. So the United States, so the problem of mass incarceration, and lots of people have written about this. Michelle Alexander, in her book, The New Jim Crow, has shown how the mass incarceration, the system that has shown that mass incarceration is not coincidental. It comes out and it follows patterns which came from the Jim Crow laws, which were a way of reestablishing the control of African Americans in the South after Reconstruction, a way of actually reinstituting to a certain extent slavery, the 13th Amendment, which freed enslaved peoples, actually has a caveat at the end that prisoners people who are in prison can be used for slaves. So there is a continuity, and then the drug war, the war on drugs raised this. If we're going to solve the problem of mass incarceration, we have to have a radical kind of rethinking. Now, the most radical rethinking is called abolition, which is getting rid of prisons. Now, that's not an idea that's going to happen overnight or next year. But the idea is that in the United States, there is a school to prison pipeline. One way of thinking about this is that if you put a map of neighborhoods in the United States, neighborhoods in our larger metropolitan areas, resources for education and resources for incarceration. And there's an inverse proportion between the two. The more resources you have for education, the fewer resources are used on incarceration, and the opposite. The same thing goes for housing and segregation and integration in housing. The same thing, all these kinds of things come together. And so the more you have, for example, police officers in public schools, the more children are going to end up eventually in the criminal justice system. So get police officers out of public schools. How do you do that? You institute restorative justice methods. You teach children how to do restorative justice. You have a restorative justice room and committee, and this has been done in lots of schools, not nearly enough, but where children are learned to mediate their peers, right? If you remember, so we all went to school. Well, we might have all gone to school, and we all got into fights and arguments, and none of us ended up in jail because we're white people. But nowadays, you have the same type of arguments, the same type of fights on the schoolyard, and somebody can end up in jail because of that. Once you end up in jail, this starts a cascading series of events, and then you end up in the juvenile prison in the United States, in Los Angeles. That's where I live. The juvenile jail in Los Angeles has an 80% recidivism rate, meaning 80% of the
Wow.
people who are there are just being prepared to go to adult jail. Now, this is a few years ago, maybe now it's a little bit more, a little less. But the adult jail is no better. Recidivism in adult jails is also around 70%, which means that we're not doing anything. We're just caging people. Now, what we're not thinking about when we cage people is that not only, so it's hard to start about with all the problems with the carceral system. One, how do you decide on a punishment? What's the difference between 3 years and 5 years, 5 years and 7 years? Right? What is the ethical rationale to give somebody 5 years in jail as opposed to 3 years? If there's no ethical rationale, then all it is vengeance. Second, when we're punishing a person, we're not only punishing him by caging them, that we're subjecting them to daily violence, rape, the stress of being in a public space 24 hours a day, the psychological damage, which will continue afterwards. Plus, once they get out of jail, in many states, they're not, in some states, they're not allowed to vote, but in many states, they're not allowed to live in government housing. They're discriminated against in getting jobs, so re-entry into the society after they supposedly paid their debt to society. Beyond that, people with families, their families lost a breadwinner. The communities lost breadwinners. The communities are further economically disadvantaged. All these things are happening because of mass incarceration. But what is the alternative? So in Los Angeles, we just had a ballot proposition in which we defeated or stopped the building of new jails to the tune of $2.3 billion and took that money and put it into alternatives to incarceration. Now, alternatives to incarceration both start way before, during, and after. So way before is plowing more resources into education, into, restorative justice in schools, into drug rehabilitation programs and drug prevention programs, to democracy education. Alternatives to incarceration after somebody has committed a crime, restorative justice programs. Right? And there are programs, there's a program called Brooklyn Justice. A woman is a great, amazing book, which all your readers should read right now, called Until We Reckon, by a woman whose last name is Sarid. I forgot her first name, but Until We Reckon, great book. Brooklyn Justice works with violent crimes. Because we have to start, whenever we have the conversation about mass incarceration, we say, well, let's just it's all because of nonviolent drug offenders. It's just people who are, caught with an ounce of grass and they were put in jail. But that's not true. We can get rid of all the nonviolent drug offenders and we still haven't really made a dent. I mean, it's a good idea. We should do it, but we still haven't really made a dent in the problem. We have to look at violent offenders because there are different types of not every violent offender is a psychopath. First of all, some people committed crimes, even heinous crimes, but 30 years ago. They're not the same people that they were 30 years ago. They're also older, right? So with age sometimes comes wisdom, which with age comes the lack of the ability or the lack of necessity to prove oneself. It's lots of different things. Secondly, some people got into a violent altercation in a bar, at a party, walking down the street. They're not violent people. They committed a violent act. And so we have to start, if there were restorative justice systems in place, these people would not end up in jail. And to go back to the first thing, the victims of the crimes, of these really bad crimes, would get their lives back to a larger extent. They would, there are lots of examples in this book, but in our current system, we never demand that a convicted criminal take responsibility for their actions. They could go through 30 years in jail, and somebody robbed a store, took somebody hostage, all this. They could go through 30 years in jail and have convinced themselves, I was screwed. I didn't do anything. So And then their victim, the guy who owned the store, the guy who was held at gunpoint, is traumatized for the rest of their lives. So who benefits from this? Right?
That's what always struck me was the idea that we're training people in prison to be prisoners. When you look at other systems like in Norway, where they're training people in prisons to be better members of society when they get out. And that's where I think a lot of the recidivism comes in, is the world's passed them by. You've been in the prison for 30 years. You have no skills, no abilities. You went in at 19, 20, you come out and you're in your 50s. And you have no ability to make it in the outside world. But the point I think people always struggle with is that they have this desire that prison should be punitive, right? It should punish the offender. They should suffer in some way. I know for me, a big part of my thinking was Sam Harris's book on free will really switched my view on that, of we should lock people up to protect society when necessary. But if we could give everyone in prison a pill to make them ideal members, it would be completely unjust to lock them up because they deserve it when tomorrow morning, right? If they had a tumor in their head that was causing them to act this way, and we could remove that tumor, and it would be unjust to say no. And in the same way, if we have the ability to train people, to teach people to be part of society, what's the Jewish argument for restorative justice, though? Forgetting the facts, the figures, and all of that. Is there a Jewish argument?
The Jewish argument for restorative justice is Chuba, one of the central foundations of Judaism. And interestingly enough, the Rambam, 13th century, great Jewish codifier, philosopher, doctor, is the first person to have pulled together all the different threads of Chuba that we see in Talmud and systematized it. And so there is a process of repentance, which includes regretting what you did, taking responsibility for what you did, promising never to do what you did again. Now, what's interesting is that he puts this both in the first part of his law book, but also which deals with prayer and belief in God and this kind of stuff. But he also puts it into torts, damages. So that if a person steals from somebody else, the legal process isn't over until the person asks forgiveness from the person he stole from. So the process and that's part of the process of repentance, right? It's not, so repentance is not separate from what we would normally think of as the judicial process. Repentance is part of the judicial process. And the reason for that is because the Rambam understands that what has really suffered in this is the possibility to live together, to create community. And that's ultimately the object of a legal system, is that we can live together. And I think that what you were saying before is totally true, but there's another half of it, which is the victim. Right? We completely ignore the victim, and the victim has no way. We've overused the word closure, right? People, and especially in the United States, people think that you have to kill murderers for closure, you have to lock people up for closure, but there's no real evidence that people get some sort of psychological closure from that. There is good evidence that people get closure from confronting the person who violated them, when the person who violated them is not going to violate them again, but the person is involved in this, and understanding and having a conversation and figuring out the ways that the victim can become whole again. And then we have two whole members of society, as opposed to two broken people.
It's interesting. To segue topics a little bit, one of the things that I think you and I would both agree on is that someone can be a very meticulous Jew in following all the laws of kashrut and Shabbat and be really not a very nice person on the scale of things. You could be a big jerk, to use some potty language. But what about the opposite of it? Can you be a good Jew without doing those things? If you follow all the ethical laws, the tzedakah, lashon hara, all of the issues of justice that you're talking about, but you've never put on tefillin. You go out on Shabbos to eat your bacon and cheeseburger, right? Where is the balance in that direction?
So you can definitely be a good person without following all the ritual laws. So the problem is that in modernity, the term "good Jew" is very vague, right? What does it mean? If we were talking 200 years ago in Warsaw, I could give you a much clearer definition, or maybe 300 years ago. But we're not. And so being a good Jew can mean a whole bunch of things. It could mean being Jewish, coincidentally by birth, and then being a good person. It could mean being good, meaning, and Aristotle has this whole thing about what you mean by good. A good tool is different than a good bowler, right? Do you have the skills? Do you fulfill the requirements or the obligations? So a person who, and nowadays, since we have different denominations of Judaism, it's good Jew according to who, right? If you're a Reform Jew, then you have as much say over the obligations as they have over you. You give the
maybe let me rephrase a little bit from your view, right? And you can correct if I'm putting words in your mouth, but I feel very much from what I've learned from you that justice is an important part of Jewish practice. That if you are observing all of the mitzvot, but you're not a just person, a kind person, a caring person, you've missed something in there. So I guess my question is on the opposite end of that, what if I was only those things? Is there something that I'm still missing in the ritual observance?
So yes, now that you put it as something you're missing, I think yes. I would argue strongly yes. In other words, what I think you're missing is opening yourself to the experience, to this spiritual and religious experience. I like the word religious more than spiritual, but there's a religious experience of what Jewish tradition has honed over a millennia, over 2 millennia. Right? There are very few, I say this often, I say it often in my office, but there's nobody else here. There are very few, the rabbis were very smart people, spiritually. As practitioners of religion, they were very smart. There are very few religious moves that are left. There are a finite number of good religious moves. I think they've used a lot of them. There are more. And I think that, for example, feminism and the gay rights movement have uncovered more moves. But I think they knew what they were doing. Now, you could argue with them about a lot of things, but the way that they've taught us to sanctify days of the week, to sanctify spaces, to from like saying brachot before you eat, saying a blessing before you eat. The what that does is it forces you to stop and think about what you're doing, right? And if the notion of saying 100 blessings a day, which I might do every once in a while, but forces one to stop during one's day and say, what are we doing here? It doesn't let you run through your day like that. And I think there's so much wisdom in a lot of Jewish ritual, which doesn't mean that there's also, chaff or there are bad moves. And it also definitely doesn't mean that there couldn't be more good moves. But I do think that somebody who is not open at all to Jewish ritual or despises Jewish ritual is missing something serious. I do think that good and bad in the moral sense, perhaps, somebody who makes fun of Jewish ritual is not a good Jew. Right? Somebody who despises other people's practices is not a good Jew. And I'd stand by that, more or less.
Great. As we get ready to wrap up a little bit, because I want to be conscious of your time, one of the teachings that we studied in one of your classes that has really stayed with me and impacted me significantly was Aron Shmuel Tamrat. And it was this idea that the whole point of mitzvot between Ben Adam L'Makom, between man and God, is really to help make us more compassionate in our dealings with other human beings, to help open up our love and our compassion, our kindness. And that to me has really been a piece of Torah that I've kind of repeated in different ways. My congregation has certainly heard that quote plenty of times from me. What for you is a piece of Torah that you've really kind of stayed with and played with over and over in your life or your
So
teaching?
there's a piece of Torah from Aaron Shmuel Tamaris, that I quote often since we're coming up on Shavuot. And I pair it with another Torah from the Ishbitzer, the nephew of the Ishbitzer Rebbe, who's also an Ishbitzer, in the Sefer Zmanim, he says that he asked the question why, the beginning of chapter 19 in Exodus starts B'chodesh HaShlishi b'tzeit b'nei Yisrael me'eretz Mitzrayim, the third month that after the Israelites went out of Egypt, and that's leading up to the revelation at Sinai. And he says, why bring in going out of Egypt when they're about to get to the highest transcendent moment of existence, seeing God revealed at Sinai? And his answer is that it was only then, after 3 months, that they managed to get Egypt out of themselves. And only once they got Egypt out of themselves were they able to hear God's word, which he says is there every day. There's, based on Pirkei Avot, that says there's a bat kol that goes out of Sinai every day that says, Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I am the Lord, I am God. And I pair that with how is it that God is introducing God's self? So here, Aaron Shmuel Tamaris says that the statement, Anochi Hashem Elokecha asher hotzitecha me'eretz Mitzrayim, I am God who's taking you out of Egypt, out of the house of bondage, means I am God who despises crass and vulgar oppression. So getting out of Egypt, and this, Tamaris says that this is the whole point of the Seder. The whole point of the Seder is, 3,000 years ago, we left physical bondage in Egypt. But the point of the Seder is to leave intellectual bondage. And that means intellectual bondage is thinking, being deluded into thinking that it is legitimate for one person to enslave or oppress another person. And so getting out of Egypt enables us to hear that God is the principle in the world that says that it is illegitimate for anybody to oppress anybody else. And so I think that that's what we have, and that's what we're preparing for. Going to Sinai is getting us to the point where we could hear that.
Great. One of the other things I don't know if you knew, as a student, I had a list of quotes that I would write down from books and all sorts of sources, including from some of my professors. And one of the quotes that always stayed with me is, I don't know what student you were referring to, as someone before my time, but you once said that by the time they finished rabbinical school, this person was actually on their way to being a Talmud Chacham, right? And I always loved that quote. And my question is, right, if it were up to you, what would be that thing that we were taught in rabbinical school that isn't getting taught? What would you add to that curriculum to make us not all Talmud Chacham, but a little bit closer? What are we missing in those 5 or 6 years?
Well, do you want the 12-year program or the 15-year program? I think that, so what I meant by that is that being a Talmud Chacham is a lifelong pursuit, right? Rabbinical school is to gain skills and an introduction to the wealth of Jewish text and tradition and law. I wish we had more time. To be able to luxuriate in that, right? And that has to do with what people have, the skills people have coming into school, has to do with the pressures on people's time to have other jobs, to get out. And I wish that in that luxuriating in Torah, being able to just learn, there was also a way that a more kind of in-depth discussion and articulation of how and at what angle Torah hit the world. I mean, I know that's done in halakha, right? We have very good professors who deal with responsa and with halacha, but in an ethical sense, how does one get enough Torah that when one sees something that's happening in the world, one thinks about it in the conceptual vocabulary of our tradition? I'll give you an example from a very, high source. When Heschel was going to the first conference on race and religion in 1963, which is where he ultimately met Martin Luther King, or their paths crossed. He opened his speech there by saying the first conference on race and religion had two participants, Moses and Pharaoh, right? And so what strikes me is not only, it's a great quote, he's very witty, but what strikes me is, what was the thought process that brought him there, right? The thought process had to be, he was so imbued with Torah that when thinking about confronting evil, what comes up, of course, confronting evil and oppression and enslavement, what immediately comes up for him is Moshe and Pharaoh, right? It wasn't a halacha that you're not allowed, that, mishpat echad yeh lechem, that everybody has to be equal under the law. It was the overriding notion of an ethical obligation which comes out of this originary story of the Jewish people. And I think that, and there's no way to get there from here except by luxuriating in Torah and then having Torah as your conceptual vocabulary. It's like, in another vein is, David Olivny Weiss, one of the greatest Talmud scholars of the 20th century, so he has written, and he's a source critic on Talmud, brilliant. He's written he finally wrote his final essay on his method, right? His understanding what Talmud is, what the method is. But the truth is, if you read all of them and then you read what he wrote, you realize that, some of it is what he tells you he's doing, but most of it is he knows all of Shas by heart. He knows everything else that's written, and then he has good instincts. So it's not really something that can be taught. It's something that you have to live. And what I wish there was more in rabbinical school was just the time to live Torah.
I definitely share that opinion. It's one of the reasons that quote made it in my list. Was it reminded me of, as much as I learned in those 6 years at Ziegler, there's so much more that I don't know. I was telling you before how my Daf Yomi attempt did not manage this year. Maybe in another 7, we'll try again. But since graduating, almost every week, I still have 2 chavrutot that we get together for an hour with one and an hour with the other. We spend maybe the first 20 minutes chatting about our weeks as rabbis, but we get to each week study a piece of Talmud slowly, or a piece of commentary slowly, and continue that process. So someday, I hope I'll also be on that journey to possibly becoming a Talmud Chacham someday. But Rabbi, it's such a pleasure to have you with us and to share your Torah. And like you were talking about before, just again, the idea of when you really just know the tradition so much, you can use it in your teachings and in every way. I think that's one of the things about your book, Justice in the City, that's so nice, is it has in-depth analysis of sugiyot along with little stories here and there, anecdotes, your own personal experiences. So anyone watching, I highly recommend it. It's a great read. You can go to your local bookstore. We won't send anyone to Amazon this time. But it's a great read. Is there anywhere else that people can go if they want to learn more about your work and your writings, your teaching?
So I have a blog, which is also called justiceinthecity.com, but it's like a hyphen between each word, or you go aryehcohen.com. And now I'm also doing a weekly podcast on Daf Shvui, a weekly Daf. So slower than, I like to think of it as slower, but more artisanal than the Daf.
That's great. Thank you again so much for being with us.
It's my pleasure. It's great talking to you. It's been too long.
If you don't love your neighbor, if you gossip about him, if you never have mercy, if he gets into trouble and you don't try